On June 17, 1887, with the noon sun driving the Colorado Territory to 100 to 4 degrees, Shane Graham rode north along the last hard stretch above Quartz Hill and stopped where the wagon trail first overlooked the canyon. Heat rose from the stone in wavering sheets that made distance uncertain, and the creek bed below looked less like water's path than a scar in pale earth, narrow and dry except for a few dark stains in shadow. Quartz Hill held 327 souls that summer, most tied to silver claims, cattle contracts, or the freight schedules that bound isolated towns to distant railheads. 3/4 of its water had once come from that canyon trickle, and the shallow wells fed by it. By June, men at the troughs drew more silt than clarity, and mothers sent children to queue before dawn with pails, as if time itself might be ladled before it vanished. Shane did not ride like a man seeking luck. He rode like a man measuring load and grade. He was 38, broad through the shoulders, weather burnished to the color of old walnut, with a left wrist stiff from a wagon overturn years earlier near Pueblo. His hands had the polished callus of ironwork and rope work, and when he lifted his hat to answer a greeting, the line at his brow showed where grief had sat for a long season without spectacle. In his wagon lay a crate of chisels, 2 steel hammers, a hand auger, line, plumb, and chalk, plus a cedar chest wrapped in canvas and tied twice against dust. That chest carried notebooks in a firm, slanted hand, copied by lamplight over many winters, not as inheritance in name only, but as an operating record, angles, frost lines, spring seat maps, ration tallies, and the measured language of souls who survived by preparation rather than confidence. He rented a room at the boarding house for 2 nights, paid in advance, and asked first not for claims or wages but for old survey notes and canyon depth marks. The boarding keeper, who had seen prospectors come and fail for 10 years, watched him trace the map edges with one finger and asked what ore he chased in that wall. Shane answered that he chased water that did not advertise itself. By supper, the remark had crossed 2 tables and the blacksmith yard. His mother, Eliza Graham, had died in February of 1885 in Trinidad, 2 winters before his arrival in Quartz Hill, after a lung fever that held for 11 days, and then took her breath in the dark before dawn. She had been born in the Tennessee Hill Country in 1826, where 3 dry years in 1 decade taught families to read stone shade and root depth with more care than they read sermons. Eliza learned from her father, and he from his mother, that the open well was a bargain with weather, while a shaded seep in limestone was a bargain with geology, and geology broke fewer promises. She had cut access notches with hand steel when she was 16, then taught the same to her son when his arms were long enough to swing a hammer without losing balance. The chain was direct and named. Her mother taught her father. Her father taught her. She taught Shane. Each lesson had cost labor. Some had cost lives nearby. He had once held a household of 3. His wife, Lena, died in childbirth in 1883, and the child died within the same day before sunset. He had buried them on a rise east of Trinidad, where cedar stayed green in lean rain years, and afterward he sold the larger team, kept 1 mule, and worked freight and repair as needed, carrying his mother's notebooks in the chest as if they were a contract still open. Those who knew him then said he grew quieter, not colder, and that when he spoke of water, he spoke with the exactness other men reserved for debt. He did not become a preacher of caution. He became an engineer of it. Quartz Hill had its own authority, and that authority wore polished boots. Gideon Mercer owned the general store, held liens on 2 wagon outfits, and brokered water rights from upstream diversions with the confidence of a man who believed markets were cleaner than mercy because prices did not blush. He was 46, broad in the waist from steady meals, with a broadcloth coat too fine for dust and a watch chain that flashed when he gestured from his porch. Even in heat, he kept gloves tucked in his belt and a silver-headed cane within reach, though he walked without need. He had built influence by extending credit in spring and collecting in winter, and few households in Quartz Hill were free of his ledger. Men listened when Mercer spoke because he had flour in his back room, and because scarcity in a frontier town could be made to resemble authority. The narrow parcel on the canyon lip had sat unsold for 16 months because the ground fell away too sharply for easy building and gave no room for livestock pens. Shane bought it on June 19th for $12 cash from a ranch widow leaving for Cannon City, and by dusk he had set 3 marker stakes and stretched line across the lip to establish his first angle. Mercer watched from horseback with 2 clerks and asked, loud enough for the road crew to hear, whether the new man intended to bury himself standing up. Shane answered without raising his voice that he intended to reach water that heat could not spend. Mercer laughed once, short and public, and called him a drifter with a grief habit who mistook sorrow for planning. By the 3rd morning, Shane had moved his tools from wagon to ground in ordered rows and begun the survey in earnest. He ran a plumb line from lip to shelf and found a vertical drop of 84 feet to the darkest band in the wall. He marked a switchback path that would yield 143 steps if each tread held 16 inches, and each drop remained near 6, with landings cut every 12 steps where pails could be shifted without forcing a full stop in narrow space. He tested the sandstone with hammer and punch, rejected 2 brittle sections, and shifted the upper line 6 feet west toward a firmer seam that rang lower and carried less crumble under repeated strike. At noon, he recorded sun angle and heat exposure in a notebook margin and noted the shaded interval from 340 to 510, the window in which seep moisture would read truest on stone. Materials cost mattered because his reserve was thin. He had $61.80 after land purchase and boarding. He paid $1.10 for a lime sack, 60 cents for sand hauled from the lower bend, and 85 cents for hemp rope to stage his first descent with body line secured to an iron pin. 2 local laborers, brothers from the freight yard, offered half days for $1 each until Mercer's clerk informed them that store credit would close if they continued. They stepped away by evening. Shane did not argue with them. He worked alone. He cut the first 7 steps before sunrise on June 24th, striking on a 3-count rhythm that conserved shoulder and reduced fracture spread. He drilled pilot holes every 20 inches along the outer edge and drove temporary pins for a hand line, then packed the rear cracks with lime sand mortar mixed at 3-to-1 and tamped with a hardwood block. By day, he wrapped wet cloth around tools to keep them from burning his palms. By evening, he lowered himself to the newest tread, tested each with full weight, and scraped loose grain until the toe held firm. Dust settled in his beard and lashes. The wall took shape one careful blow at a time. Souls passing on the upper road began to pause and look down at the chalked path and iron pins, and ask one another why a widower would carve stairs into open heat when wells, however reduced, still gave some water. Children repeated what they heard at home. Teamsters repeated what they heard on Mercer's porch. By the week's end, as June bent toward July and the town prayed for monsoon clouds that did not gather, Mercer gave the project a name meant to diminish it. He stood outside his store with a ledger under one arm and told a circle of buyers that the canyon work would be remembered as Graham's descent, proof that fear could wear the clothes of industry. The phrase crossed the boardwalks before sundown and returned by lantern light as shorthand for panic. While below the lip, Shane marked the 8th step, then the 9th, and kept cutting toward the dark stone where moisture still held at noon. Below the lip, where Mercer's new name drifted down as laughter, Shane drove the chisel again and opened the 10th step to full depth, then sat back on his heels and listened to the stone answer the blow. The wall gave 3 sounds: a shallow, brittle click where grain would shear, a blunt thud where trapped sand weakened the face, and a low bell tone where the seam held. He trusted that bell tone more than any promise made from a porch. By July 2nd, just after sunrise, the communal well behind Mercer's store measured less than 3 feet of standing water, where it had held 18 feet 10 days earlier. The drop became public fact when 2 ranch hands lowered a weighted line in front of witnesses and called depth aloud, while 30 souls watched in silence. Dust rose from boots and did not settle quickly. The noon temperature reached 101 degrees, and the wind carried the dry mineral smell that meant the upper draws had not seen useful rain. That evening, the town council gathered in the church hall and voted ration limits by household: 2 buckets per day for homes with fewer than 4 souls, 3 buckets for larger homes, and no allowance for stock beyond 1 shared trough at dawn. The vote passed 5-2. A clerk read a second statement that the canyon seep remained unverified and unsafe for public reliance, a claim made without municipal survey. Men nodded because the language sounded official. Mothers did not nod. They counted buckets in their heads. Shane stood in the doorway through the vote and spoke only once, asking whether he might submit measured flow if he reached the shelf by week's end. Councilman Reed answered that a private staircut did not constitute infrastructure. Mercer, seated in the first row with his hat on his knee and his watch chain bright in lamplight, added that no prudent town should follow a widower into a grave cut in rock. Several men laughed because they had heard him say it before. No one asked who would carry water if the well failed outright. He went directly from the hall to the blacksmith yard and bought what his earlier tool list had lacked: 2 star drills, 4 cold wedges, 1 hand maul with a hickory handle, and 2 tins of lamp oil. The total came to $6.40, entered on a scrap receipt he folded into Eliza's notebook. He had planned to stretch his cash through August, but planning bent to conditions and he adjusted without speech. On July 3rd, he reset his work line from the upper stakes and began driving permanent pins at 20-inch intervals along the outer edge of the descending path. Each hole was drilled to 5 inches, dust cleared with a reed tube, then pins seated with 3 heavy strikes and a quarter turn to lock against pull. He tarred the exposed iron to slow rust, looped rope through eyelets, and tested each run with full body weight before setting the next. At step 13, he encountered a fractured pocket and cut back 8 inches to sound face, sacrificing width rather than trusting weak stone under load. Mercer's store adjusted faster than the council. The painted sign still read, "General Goods," but by the first week of July he raised water from 5 cents a bucket to 12, arguing scarcity required discipline and transport cost. Families with account debt paid from future wages. Families without credit sold tools or blankets. A widow named Agnes Coyle traded her husband's spare saddle for 6 days of water and coarse flour. Mercer's ledger thickened while his porch speeches grew sharper. He repeated that Graham's dissent was panic, dressed as workmanship, and told laborers plainly that any man who took wages on the canyon wall would find his store credit suspended until further notice. 2 freight yard brothers had returned once more to ask Shane for half-day work. They left before noon when the warning reached them. Shane handed them the coin for the morning anyway and told them to keep their own households supplied first. He did not ask again. Through July and into August, he worked in 2 windows, from 4:30 until heat drove iron too hot to hold, then from 7:10 until dark. The steps kept the same measure wherever the wall allowed it, 16 inches tread by 6 inches rise, with landings every 12 steps. He mixed mortar at 3 parts sand to 1 part lime, added water by cup rather than pour, and packed cracks in thin lifts so they cured hard, rather than chalking out under traffic. He cut shallow drainage channels at the inner rear corners of each tread, no deeper than a thumb joint, so sudden rain would run inward to collection points instead of icing the lip in cold weather. Even in drought, he prepared for cold. Eliza had taught him that scarcity changed form but not intent. By July 19th, the stair reached 31 finished steps and one broad landing shaded from late afternoon sun. He lowered himself farther with a body line and observed moisture on the target band as a dark sheen no wider than 2 hands. At noon, the sheen narrowed but did not vanish. At dusk, it spread. He marked both widths in his notebook and began chiseling toward a shelf that could hold 4 pail carriers at once without crowding. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, friend. Whether you live near high desert stone or rain-soaked timber, these lessons in practical preparation travel across any landscape. Subscribe so you do not miss what this canyon is about to demand. Now, back to the story. By the second week of August, swallows that usually nested under the assay roof through September were already gone. Mule deer trails appeared lower in the draws, packed fresh each morning where brush still held faint moisture. Evenings cooled in a way that relieved the skin but troubled experienced stockmen, because the cool arrived too quickly and ended too cleanly at dawn, as if heat and cold were changing watches without the gradual handover of a normal season. Shane said little about signs unless asked. When asked, he answered directly that the sky was storing violence and would spend it in one payment. At step 58, he began drilling full-depth eyelets for a continuous rope rail. The eyelets were set at waist height for adults, with a second low line on the outer run where children could grip. He wrapped splice points in waxed cloth and replaced any strand that raised splinters. At every 5th landing, he widened the platform by 18 inches beyond his first plan. The added stone removal cost him 4 evenings of work and 1 extra wedge, but it allowed queue space without forcing elders to stand on sloped tread. One afternoon, Mercer rode down with 2 teamsters and watched the work in silence for several minutes, then spoke so the men above could hear. He said no sane town would entrust its thirst to damp rock and rope, and that those who chased seep water would drag their families into a ditch when proper commerce still stood in town. Shane cleaned dust from the latest drilled hole, seated the pin, and answered without looking up. Let them talk. Words do not keep out thirst. Mercer turned his horse hard enough to scatter shale. On August 24th, after 72 completed steps, Shane reached the limestone seam behind the dark band and opened a test slot with careful lateral strikes. Water emerged in steady thread, then gathered to run clear across the chisel face. He timed fill in a marked tin and repeated it 4 times for accuracy. The seep averaged 7 gallons per minute, slower at noon, stronger after sunset, never dropping below 6 in the 2 days he measured. That rate could not rescue cattle herds or mills. It could keep a town alive if rationed with order. The discovery changed the scope of his labor. Until that day, he had built for 1 household and contingency. After that day, he built for 327 souls and panic management. He moved the tool chest to the rim, posted a rough slate for counts, and began framing cistern bases with stone and timber, scrounged from scrap piles and paid lots. Each cistern was laid to hold 900 gallons, circular, with mortared interior and cedar plank lids, hinged to keep dust, vermin, and direct sun out. He stretched layered cloth filters over intake mouths and weighted the cloth with removable rings so they could be washed and reset each turn. Costs rose as quickly as urgency. Cedar boards, hinge iron, and 2 additional rope coils ran $11.20. Lime and hauled sand for cistern mortar added $3.05. He sold his spare revolver, unused since spring, for $9 to close the gap, and kept 1 small knife for utility only. The town noticed the cistern frames rising above the canyon lip and laughed less openly after that, though few crossed the road to offer help. On September 11th, a warm rain passed over Quartz Hill, brief and fragrant, turning dust to dark patches and drawing families into doorways to feel drops on their faces. Children set pans under eaves. Men at the store declared the drought broken before clouds had fully moved east. That evening, outside the church, Mercer stood under the awning and said stone stairs could not outvote weather. Some souls agreed because relief is persuasive when it arrives in sound and scent. Shane spent that same evening on the wall by lantern light, adding 3 bypass niches to his existing line, so two-way traffic could pass without shoulder strikes. Each niche was carved chest-deep into the inner wall at intervals where sightlines remained clear. A descending carrier could step in and brace while ascending carriers passed. He tested each recess with loaded buckets and marked safe footing with white lime dashes visible in low light. During the third week of September, he spent his remaining $18 on extra rope, tin ladles, and pine torches dipped for wind resistance. He nailed a board at the top landing and wrote rules in block letters large enough to read by torch. Children first, then elders, then all others by line. 1 quart per soul per turn until further notice. He drove the post deep and braced it in stone so no hurried hand could pull it free in anger. The first to ask for regular work under that board was Thomas Bell, 13 years old, son of a laundress and a mule driver, laid up with a broken ankle. Thomas had watched from the upper road for weeks, then came at dawn with a slate, 2 chalk stubs, and a face set in practical seriousness beyond his years. Shane did not place him on the stairs. He placed him at the rim table where risk was low and order mattered most. The boy learned quickly. Count household marks, track quart turns, call next line clear, and refuse pressure from loud voices with the same words each time. 1 quart per soul. Next. By September 21st, when dawn temperatures fell to 34 degrees after weeks near 90, Quartz Hill possessed a functioning stair to seep flow, 2 lidded cisterns near full, posted ration rules, rope rails at dual height, and a line system practiced by repetition rather than hope. Most of the town still called it Graham's Descent. A smaller number had begun, quietly, to call it the Steps. On the morning of September the 21st, while frost still clung in thin white lines to the wagon ruts above the canyon, and the eastern sky held a hard brass color, Shane set Tomas to tally practice and carried a fresh coil of rope to the 43rd step, where repeated hands had already polished the stone edge smoother than he liked. He knotted a replacement line through the eyelet run with a double bend his mother had taught him for wet strain, then hung from the line with full weight and a swinging test to mimic panic pulls. The iron held. The knot held. He scraped one tread that had begun to cup under traffic, packed the shallow depression with a lime sand patch mixed stiff, and marked it with crossed chalk so no carrier would trust it until cure. By noon, he had moved to the rim and begun the work that no observer praised, because it looked like caution rather than strength. He built a settling box upstream of the cistern inlets from scrap plank and mortared stone, 30 inches long and 18 wide, with 3 removable baffles that forced seep water to slow and drop grit before entering storage. He lined the final chamber with washed gravel, then layered coarse cloth over willow charcoal, burned clean from last week's cuttings. The charcoal did not make foul water pure, and he did not claim it could. It bought margin against silt and taste, while better choices were made elsewhere. He wrote that plainly on a second board and nailed it beside the ration rules. Filters help. Boiling helps more. Do not draw from open well after storm runoff. The project had grown from a cut path to a system. A narrow trench now carried overflow away from the top landing, so spillage would not glaze the work in sudden cold. A dry wood rack stood under canvas for torches and spare handles. Two broad hooks at the rim held lift yokes for soles too weak to climb with weight. Thomas's table had been moved 6 feet back from the lip and staked against wind. Shane added a short rail around that table, waist high, so no jostle in line would knock the boy toward the drop when tempers rose. Every piece looked plain. Every piece solved one foreseeable failure. At sundown, when the temperature fell from 64 to 38 in less than an hour, he tested night movement with 6 volunteers from households that had begun to trust him quietly. They descended empty and returned with quarter-filled pails to practice footing under torchlight, pausing at each bypass niche and calling pass left, pass right in an even cadence Thomas could hear from above. 2 missteps occurred on landing 9 where wind hit from the west and blew smoke across sight lines. Shane shifted the torch bracket, cut 1 additional toe notch, and reset the call order so no one moved without answer from the next niche. Practice ended with no spill larger than a cup. 3 days passed between council notices, and in that small interval the canyon route received more practical refinement than Quartz Hill had put into public water planning in 10 years. Shane shaved splinters from the cedar lids and added felted wool strips to their seams, so dust and night cold would not creep in through gaps. He drove 2 final pins at the top curve where carriers tended to lean outward from fatigue. He measured seep draw against line demand twice each day, at dawn and at the last light, and wrote numbers where Tomas could read them aloud when impatient men questioned fairness. Dawn draw, 6 gallons and 3 quarts per minute. Dusk draw, 7 1/4. Cistern 1, 840 gallons. Cistern 2, 820. Facts quieted argument better than volume. Mercer answered preparation with theater. On September 22nd, before breakfast trade, he set a barrel on the store porch and broke its head with a mallet, so all could see the bottom caked in dark silt from recent draws, then declared that fear-mongering had pushed decent families toward a cliff route unfit for livestock. He sent his clerk to post a notice at the church board, claiming the canyon stair had no municipal inspection, no indemnity, and no guaranteed sanitation. Language chosen to sound like law, whether law stood behind it or not. He spoke in complete sentences, polished as his boots, and he repeated the phrase Graham's descent as if repeating it could make stone revert to ridicule. The cruelty widened beyond his porch. Teamsters carrying empty casks to his yard began to call out counts when they passed Thomas, saying 1 quart for little kings and beggars alike, a rule for men who had given up on honest labor. 2 women in line pulled their children aside when Shane approached to check lid seals, telling them not to stand close to grief, or they would learn to expect ruin. At the boarding house, a plate set aside for him was withdrawn after Mercer's bookkeeper mentioned unpaid tabs in a tone that suggested consequences for generosity. By evening, Shane was cooking beans over his own coals beside the rim table, sharing half with Thomas and saying little while insults traveled up and down the road like wind-borne ash. Institutional pressure followed social pressure. Councilman Reed came at dusk with a folded paper that asked Shane to suspend public use until an appointed committee could inspect the stairs, the filters, and the line protocol. The committee had no engineer, no mason, and no timetable. Reed's eyes remained on the paper while he read. Shane did not argue politics. He asked one question. If he closed now, where would households draw if the well turned bad after rain? Reed answered that no such determination had been made. Shane requested that sentence be written on the notice itself. Reed declined and left with the paper unsigned. Mercer called that refusal proof of lawlessness the next morning and said in hearing of 40 souls that desperate men always hid behind technical words. He offered temporary price relief at 10 cents a bucket if customers signed a pledge to draw only from approved town sources. 16 signed before noon. 11 of those same signatures appeared at the canyon rim by dusk, hats low, asking quietly whether the court rules still applied if a man had spoken against it in public. Thomas looked to Shane. Shane told the line that the rule applied to thirst, not speeches, and motioned them forward in order. The mockery reached its sharpest edge when Mercer himself walked to the top landing during second draw and asked for first place on grounds of civic duty, saying his obligations required him in town while laborers could wait. No one moved. Thomas held the slate against his chest and repeated, voice trembling but clear, children first, then elders, then all others by line. Mercer stared at the boy long enough to make 2 women flinch, then stepped aside with an expression stripped of porch confidence. The line advanced 1 mark at a time, and for the first time in months, Mercer stood within a rule he had not written. By the 4th evening of open operation, the phrase Graham's dissent had split into 2 meanings depending on who spoke it. From Mercer's followers, it remained accusation, a way to make preparation sound like surrender. From households that had carried water safely through sleet wind and pre-dawn cold, it became practical direction. Meet at the descent, bring your marked pail, hold your place, watch your footing. Language was shifting under pressure. So was authority. Warning signs gathered with a precision the town preferred not to examine. The brief, warm rain of September 11th had greened nothing lasting, and now a second pattern declared itself. Sunset clouds began to stack upriver in high anvils with green-gray undersides, not drifting systems but towering cells that formed fast and dissolved by dark, as if rehearsing violence. Dust devils that usually crossed the flats at midday vanished entirely. At night, halos ringed the moon in double circles, and by dawn, the ring would be gone, leaving a sky clear enough to deceive the unwary. Shane read signs in sequence, never as single omens. The canyon's seep temperature held near 52 degrees, despite cold mornings, while surface troughs skimmed thin ice before sunrise. That divergence meant deep groundwater remained stable, while exposed stores would fail quickly if hard freeze followed rainfall. He sent Thomas with written notes to 3 households that cared for elders, advising them to fill indoor kettles before dusk and keep 2 days of boiled reserve by the stove. He sent a second note to the schoolhouse asking that drinking pails be covered and refilled only from settled water until the weather pattern broke. The schoolteacher, Ruth Ellery, thanked the boy and folded the note into her ledger. Others laughed when they heard of it, saying weather did not obey stair builders. The day before, on September 21st, late in the afternoon, mule teams returning from the lower wash came in, restless, ears back, refusing trough water until handlers skimmed floating grit no one had seen arrive. A ranch hand reported a dead pronghorn lodged high in cottonwood branches 2 miles upriver, carried there by an unseasonable surge that had left no standing water at the site by noon. Old Mateo Ruiz at the assay office, who had watched creek metals and flood stains since Quartz Hill's founding year, touched the pale line on the canyon wall with his cane and said it matched the mark from the storm of 1878. Though that year had held more snow and less dust, he said this quietly and only 2 men listened. By nightfall, wind turned from the north in dry pulses that arrived without warning and stopped as abruptly, slamming shutters once and then leaving silence so complete that church bells seemed louder than their bronze should allow. Shane walked the full stair with a hooded lantern, checking every eyelet and every niche, then returned to the rim and added 1 final instruction beneath the ration board, in letters cut deep with his knife point. If thunder comes upriver, seal the well Draw here in order. No running on the steps. Most souls slept as if the season had merely turned and would settle by habit. A few did not sleep. They sat with boots on, listening between gusts. At dawn on September the 22nd, the thermometer outside the blacksmith shed read 29 degrees, while far south beyond the ridge a line of cloud rose black and vertical against first light, too high, too fast, and moving toward watercourses that fed Quartz Hill before they fed fear. By 7 o'clock that morning, the black cloud line had reached the upper drainage and begun to break itself against the canyon country in bursts so dense they looked, from Quartz Hill's ridge, like curtains of iron chain dropped from the sky. Rain did not fall evenly. It struck in concentrated columns that pounded one ravine white, while the next remained dry for 10 more minutes, then shifted without warning. Men on the store porch counted seconds between lightning and thunder and told one another the storm would spin itself upriver. But by 8:15, the first brown surge arrived in the canyon below town, carrying sticks, uprooted brush, and a sour smell of churned mud that did not belong to clear spring flow. Shane was already at the rim, oilcloth tied over the ration board, lids weighted on both cisterns. Thomas at the tally table with slate wrapped in waxed canvas. He sent 2 volunteers to the schoolhouse with written warning to seal all open pails and boil only from covered stores. He sent another pair toward the church cistern with orders to inspect for roof runoff breach. Down in the canyon, the water rose another 18 inches in less than 20 minutes, not as a smooth climb, but as repeated surges that slammed debris against the banks and left new stain lines each time. The communal well behind Mercer's store began to cloud before 9. First tan, then opaque, then streaked with gray foam, where runoff entered through cracks in the stone curb. At 9:40, with rain still striking upriver and only a cold wind over town itself, Mercer ordered his clerks to roll out 3 reserve barrels and sell by strict coin only. No ledger marks until quality returned. The first 2 barrels drew a queue that bent around the porch steps. The third barrel, tapped in haste, released water with visible grit and a faint carrion odor that made even thirsty hands hesitate. Mercer swore at the cooper, blamed transport, and ordered the bung reset. His authority had long depended on the idea that his stock stood apart from weather. By mid-morning, that idea was breaking in public. The storm ended as abruptly as it had formed. At 11:10, sunlight reached the boardwalks and gave the town a false hour of relief while mud still roared below the canyon bends. Children were called outdoors. Shutters opened. One ranch foreman laughed and said the worst had passed. Then temperature dropped with a speed that unsettled even old residents. At noon, it was 41 degrees in wind shade. By 3, it was 26. The wet edges of troughs skinned over in brittle ice. Water spilled from bucket lips and froze where it landed, turning plank steps and porch stones into slick plates. Weather had changed from flood threat to freeze hazard before households could reset their routine. 46 hours after first surge, the thermometer at the blacksmith shed read 11 degrees before dawn on September the 24th. Shallow pipes split. Yard pumps locked. The church rain barrels froze from top down, leaving only a narrow column that could not be drawn without breaking the staves. Mercer's open storage casks, never meant for such a swing, formed thick rims that trapped silt-laden water beneath, unfit for drinking and slow to melt. Teamsters tried to move 2 intact barrels into the store cellar, but one slipped from an icy plank, cracked its side hoop, and emptied half its contents into frozen dirt. By that morning, the store that had governed thirst by price had rows of containers no household trusted. Quartz Hill's built order failed in sequence. The communal well was first, contaminated by runoff, and then half seized by ice. Private wells followed, either foul from infiltration or too shallow to draw, once cold tightened the upper soil. Roof catchments gave only slush. Cattle troughs turned to crusted basins that animals pawed in frustration. The town's confidence in familiar systems, so loudly defended through summer, shrank to rumor and argument. Only the canyon seep remained consistent, insulated by depth, flowing near 52 degrees behind limestone, while every exposed source swung between contamination and lock. By late afternoon on the first freeze day, Ruth Ellery kept 6 schoolchildren inside the schoolhouse, stove fed with split pine and windows sealed with spare copybook paper to cut drafts. She had accepted Shane's note and covered her pails, but one younger child arrived feverish and vomiting from water taken earlier at home. Ruth used her own cup to wet cloths and cool foreheads while waiting for someone to bring safer supply from the rim. She drank from the same reserve between tending the children. By evening, she was shaking with chills so hard that 2 mothers had to hold her shoulders while she continued giving instructions for lessons that would not be taught. She died before dawn, seated against the schoolroom wall with attendance ledger open on her knees and all 6 children sleeping under coats she had gathered around them. Word of her death moved through town without shouting, which made it heavier. Ruth had taught letters to miners' sons and ranch daughters in the same room, had copied scripture for burials when hands trembled, had never missed a winter term. Her passing gave contamination a face and a cost no one could debate. The school bell rang once at noon and then was left silent. That same night, a brief notice appeared on the church board and was repeated in low voices along the queue. Jonah Pike, 9 years old, had died just past midnight after a fall into freezing runoff during an attempted side bank draw with older kin. The details came by witness account, not spectacle, and no one argued over them. By dawn, his dented tin pail stood outside the Pike door, left where it had been set down, because grief had made ordinary movement feel like betrayal. By the second night of hard cold, old Mateo Ruiz sat on his porch with canteen at his feet and gloves folded beside him, waiting for his turn at a source he believed younger families should reach first. He had worked the assay office since Quartz Hill's founding year and had seen flood marks and ore booms and winter shortages enough to distrust haste. 2 neighbors urged him to step ahead in line because of age. He refused each time, saying a town that forgot order in scarcity forgot itself next. Before dawn, he was found leaning against the porch post, canteen empty, face turned toward the canyon road. He had not called for help. He had yielded place until yielding became final. 3 named deaths in 2 days changed the tone of every street in Quartz Hill. Mockery did not survive contact with that ledger. Doors stayed shut against wind, yet lines formed at dawn wherever rumor named drinkable water. Voices rose quickly and broke just as quickly into pleading. Families who had once signed Mercer's pledge now brought any container that could hold a quart. Coffee tins, lamp chimneys wrapped at the base, cracked pitchers tied with cloth. No one asked about municipal inspection. They asked how long their children could go without fever. Midway through a sleet squall that stung exposed skin like thrown sand, Thomas Bell crossed town from the rim to fetch Shane from a brief tool errand at the blacksmith shed. The boy's cap was soaked through and stiff at the brim with ice. He did not waste words. He said the line at the steps had doubled. 2 elders had nearly fallen on landing 12, and Mercer was coming with 3 men to demand front position for official distribution. Thomas's hands shook from cold and effort, but his count slate was still tucked inside his coat, dry under his shirt. He had guarded the numbers before guarding himself. Shane took the shortest route back, carrying 2 extra torches, a coil of spare rope, and a sack with boiled cloth strips for hand wraps. At the rim, he found exactly what Tomas had reported. 100 souls in a line that bent past the first marker post, boots slipping on rime, children pressed between adults to keep warm, and the rope rail already dark with melt and grip. He did not call speeches. He reorganized movement in 30 seconds. Two-person descents only. Full stop at each fifth landing. Empty carriers to the inside wall. Filled carriers to the outer rail. Tomas on counts. A ranch widow on elder assistance. A blacksmith apprentice on torch rotation. Order returned not because fear vanished, but because instructions were concrete and repeated. Mercer arrived within minutes, coat collar high, gloves new. Two clerks behind him carrying stamped store buckets as if symbols still governed scarcity. He announced that as water right broker, he would supervise priority distribution from the top landing and that his barrels would be replenished first for town stability. The line did not part. Tomas repeated the posted rule, voice strained but steady. Children first, then elders, then all others by line. Mercer stepped toward the rope to force passage. Boot heel hit glazed stone at the rim curve, and his weight pitched outward toward the drop. He caught nothing but air for a breathless moment, then struck the rope rail chest high and swung against the wall. The same rope he had mocked held him. The pin set at 20-inch interval held him. Shane moved down 2 steps, braced his stance, and hauled with a freight man on the upper side until Mercer's boots found purchase again. No one cheered. No one laughed. Survival had no appetite for spectacle. Shane set him upright, checked his grip, and pointed to the back of the waiting line with the same motion he used for every other late arrival. Mercer stared at him, breathing hard, pride and shock crossing his face like weather. Then he went where he was directed. Through that night and the next day, the carved route ran as infrastructure rather than project. Buckets descended empty and rows measured. Cistern lids opened and closed on count. The settling box caught grit that would have entered cups. Torches were replaced before failure, not after. By the evening of September 25th, after nearly 40 hours of continuous operation with brief shifts, Quartz Hill had not solved its disaster, but it had a functioning heart for water, and it beat from the canyon wall where one widower had cut stone against laughter until laughter ran out. When the second night shift formed, Shane added one more rule to keep the line from collapsing into exhaustion. No household would leave with water only. Each household would leave with one task. Men with broad backs carried split piñón to the schoolhouse stove and to the 2 homes where fever still ran. Women with steady hands took filter cloth to boiled wash kettles, scrubbed silt and refitted rings. Older boys scraped ice from the upper approach with flat shovels and sanded the planks. Thomas kept names and assignments on a second slate, so no family was asked twice before all had carried a share. Aid became reciprocal by design, not by sentiment. Shane opened his own parcel shed before dawn on September the 26th, moved his tool chest to one side, and set 3 camp cots along the back wall for elders waiting between turns. He gave up his blanket roll to old couples and slept in his coat against the cistern wall when sleep could be had. The boarding house that had withdrawn his plate sent no food. A ranch widow, then a blacksmith wife, then a miner whose debt sat heavy in Mercer's ledger began sending beans, hard bread, and coffee to the rim table in covered tins. The food was plain. It was enough. The line held better when hands were warm. By the 4th day of continuous draw, he shifted from emergency rhythm to teachable rhythm. Every descent pair learned one skill while they waited: how to listen for brittle stone under heel, how to test rope fibers for hidden cuts, how to boil 1 quart hard for a full minute before cooling in covered cups, how to keep children to the inner wall where panic pushes least. He showed 3 young laborers the proper angle for recutting a rounded tread and had them repair landing 9 under his eye. He taught 2 laundresses to read seep clarity in a white enamel pan before opening a cistern lid. He taught a preacher and a teamster how to clear the settling box baffles without stirring trapped sediment into the final chamber. In that cold week, instruction sat beside rationing as equal work. Mercer's expensive system failed in full arithmetic. By the end of September, he had lost 2 imported barrels to cracked hoops, 1 wagon load to frozen axle delay, and a month of goodwill that no ledger could rebalance. His shelves, once stacked to rafters, showed bare plank behind a few sacks of meal gone clump from damp. He still possessed coin, title, and store walls, yet his central commodity had shifted beyond his control to a seep line reached by hand-cut steps. He came to the rim on the 5th morning with gloves removed and asked, in a voice stripped of porch projection, where he should stand. Thomas pointed him to shovel duty at the upper bend. Mercer took the shovel and worked until his palms bled through skin. No cheer met that change, and none was asked for. The canyon rim had no spare breath for spectacle. What it had at last was a shared schedule that held through sleet, cough, grief, and hunger. Names moved from one slate to another. Loads were weighed by eye and corrected when heavy hands tilted toward advantage. Children were counted first, elders second, then the rest by line order, 1 quart per soul per turn, exactly as posted. In weather that turned mercy into math, precision itself became mercy. 3 days passed before a single relief wagon from the south reached Quartz Hill by a hazardous wash detour cut through unstable ground. A one-off passage made at risk, and not a true reopening of the road. It brought clean water casks and medical powders, and by then the canyon operation had become the town's primary source by routine rather than by emergency decree. The council, which had once delayed behind paper language, posted Shane's rules at the church board, word for word, and added a 4th line in Reed's hand. Violation of line order. Risks all souls. No one tore it down. At Ruth Ellery's schoolhouse, mothers found the note Thomas had delivered before the storm, still folded into Ruth's ledger, and copied it into household books as practical doctrine. Cover pails, boil reserve, trust-tested flow over convenient rumor. Jonah Pike's pail was hung above the school door for the remainder of that winter, not as spectacle but as measure. Mateo Ruiz's empty canteen was placed on the front shelf of the assay office with his name burned into the leather strap. By the 2nd week of October, temperatures held below freezing each dawn, and the town that had once mocked rope rails now sent 2 volunteers every night to inspect islets with lantern and mallet. Shane did not keep authority to himself. He divided the stair into maintenance sections, assigned each section to mixed crews, and required that every crew include 1 soul older than 50 and 1 younger than 20, so knowledge would cross generations in both directions. Failures were logged on slate, then copied at week's end into a bound record purchased with pooled coin. At Thomas's insistence, the record included costs down to the cent, because memory without numbers had misled Quartz Hill before. On October the 28th, when roads reopened in reliable fashion and the immediate peril had eased, the bell called a sober gathering at the church. No decorations were set. No music was played. 2 benches at the front remained empty for Ruth Ellery and Jonah Pike, and Mateo Ruiz's cane rested across them. The room held nearly all 327 souls, shoulders packed tight in wool and work coats, faces marked by fatigue that had not yet lifted. Councilman Reed read the names of the dead and the names of those still recovering from fever, then set the paper down and said that a town could survive weather and still fail character unless it named its own conduct plainly. Mercer stood next. Prosperity still clothed him, but reduced and without shine. Broadcloth brushed dull, boots unpolished, hands scarred by shovel blisters not yet healed. He spoke for 130 words without flourish. He said that he had called caution cowardice, called preparation panic, and called a grieving man unfit to be followed. He repeated his own phrase, Graham's dissent, then said the phrase had hidden his fear of losing command. He admitted he had raised water from 5 cents to 12 in scarcity and had mistaken profit for prudence while families counted cups. He acknowledged that the rope line he mocked had saved his life when his own footing failed. He said he was ashamed. He did not ask to be excused. Others rose in turn. 2 Teamsters repeated the insults they had thrown at Thomas and asked the boy's mother whether work could repay what words had harmed. A woman who had pulled her children aside from Shane said she had taught distrust as if it were wisdom and had watched that lesson collapse in one cold week. Reed acknowledged the unsigned suspension notice and said, governance that waited for perfect authority in a moving disaster was governance that chose delay over duty. No one disputed him. The confessions were not theatrical. They were granular, specific, and entered into memory with the same weight as measurements. Then the room turned to Shane. He remained standing where he had listened, near the side aisle, hat in both hands, coat sleeves dusted wide at the cuffs from fresh mortar. When he spoke, he did not soften the record. He said his mother had taught him that stone remembers every blow, whether strike was made in care or contempt, and communities remembered in the same manner. He said words from porches had cost trust that could not be restored by one meeting, and 3 souls were dead, while the town learned what it should have learned in July. He said he would not pretend those facts were light. He said he had not carved the wall to be right in public. He had carved it so children would drink when systems failed. He paused, then gave the terms that would govern forward. Any household that wished to draw from Graham's steps would send 1 member each week for maintenance instruction. Any merchant, including Mercer, would post water prices and source quality in clear writing during shortages, with council audit open to all. Any council vote touching water would include 2 appointed laborers, 1 school representative, and 1 elder from the assay office records. He said forgiveness was not a coin to be spent for comfort. It would be measured in work repeated through seasons. He said he would teach step cutting, seep mapping, and ration order to any soul who came sober and willing. Then he sat down. No applause followed at first. The room stayed still long enough to hear stovepipe ticks and winter wind at the clapboards. Then benches creaked as people stood, not in celebration but in assent to obligation. Reed asked Thomas to carry a fresh slate to the church vestibule. By lantern light, they wrote the first maintenance roster under Shane's terms, and families signed in coal pencil until the list ran off the board's lower edge. Work began the next morning. Through winter and spring of 1888, crews expanded the descent from 143 to 168 safer steps, easing 2 steep transitions and adding iron handrails where freeze-gloss had proven worst. A second filtered cistern was built 12 feet above the previous floodline with double wallstone and drain channel. Mercer paid material invoices at cost and signed each one in open ledger, then carried rock on shoulder yokes beside miners and clerks. Thomas, still 13 through that winter and 14 by summer, became line captain on cold mornings, then apprentice surveyor under Shane by autumn. The derisive nickname did not vanish. It inverted. Build it like Graham's dissent became common instruction on any project where failure would cost lives. The record book thickened with more than names. It held seep draw checks at dawn and dusk, cloth changes by date, iron pin replacements by position, and notes on where frost formed first when winds shifted east. It marked where children tended to stumble when carrying half-full tins, and where elders needed a pause rail at shoulder height rather than hip height. It logged boil advisories whenever runoff colored the upper channel, and listed which households had spare fuel to share for safe heating. Each entry turned hard days into transferable method. Eliza's notebook logic, once private inheritance, moved into public routine without fanfare. When storms returned in late winter, the town no longer waited for argument. Spotters watched the upriver cloud shelf at first light. Thomas posted warnings before noon when snowmelt threatened sediment surge. Cistern lids were checked twice daily without being told. Settling baffles were lifted, rinsed, and reset by crews that rotated exactly as scheduled. The line still grew long on bad mornings, but it did not break. No one tested priority by wealth. No one asked whether children still counted first. Those questions had been answered in September and buried with the dead. By early spring of 1888, with freeze less severe and road traffic steady again, Quartz Hill's danger eased from acute to watchful. The canyon route remained active, not as relic, but as primary reserve and daily proof that planning could outrun pride. On a clear Sunday after thaw, the church board carried 3 standing notices side by side: the draw order, the boil guidance, and the maintenance roster for the coming week. At the bottom, in a hand steadier than it had been in autumn, Thomas added a line copied from Shane's instruction and from Eliza's pages before it. Stone remembers. So must we. Prepare to share. The ink on Thomas Bell's added line had not yet dried when Shane stepped into the church vestibule, took the chalk from the boy's hand, and drew a square around the 3 notices so wind could not blur their edges before Monday dawn. Mercer stood 2 paces away with his hat held against his chest, waiting as families filed past the board in silence to read each rule before they went home. He said, low enough that only Shane and Thomas could hear, "I have the pledge sheets and the price ledger in my office. I would like them copied into the town record exactly as written, with my name at the bottom. If a lesson is to hold, it must hold against my own handwriting." Shane looked at him for a measured moment, and then nodded once. "Bring them at first light. Bring also the suspension notice Reed carried and did not post. Paper hidden is still paper that acted." Reed, who had paused in the doorway and heard his name, didn't defend himself. He said, "I kept that notice in my desk drawer. I will bring it. Let it sit where all can read it." At sunrise on Monday, while frost still glazed the upper rail, they laid every document on the rim table. Mercer's coin-only barrel orders, the signed pledge sheets, the unsigned suspension draft, Ruth Ellery's folded warning note from her ledger, and Thomas's slates now copied to bound pages. Shane asked the schoolchildren to read each one aloud in turn, so no adult could pretend the language was too fine to understand. The words sounded thinner in the morning cold than they had sounded in pride, but they held their meaning. Reed entered them into the official book, including dates, temperatures, and the exact prices raised from 5 cents to 12. By late winter, the square of notices had become a habit instead of an emergency marker, and families stopped reading it with clenched jaws and started reading it with pencils in hand. Names were added for inspections, repairs, and boil checks before the ink from prior days had faded. The line no longer moved by shouting. It moved by memory trained into muscle. On April 3, 1888, a second upriver storm tested Quartz Hill without warning at noon, and this time the town moved as one body before the first muddy surge reached the lower bend. Spotters at the ridge rang the church bell in 3 short pulls. Children left lessons in pairs, each carrying a covered cup from the school reserve. Mercer and the 2 teamsters who had once mocked Thomas pulled tarps across the cistern lids and checked hinge pins by lantern in daylight darkened by cloud. The preacher and the laundresses cleared the settling baffles in practiced sequence. No order had to be shouted twice. A ranch hand slipped at landing 14 with a half-full pail, struck the inner wall and dropped to one knee. 2 souls from the opposite lane moved into the bypass niche exactly as taught. and Shane's old call traveled down the stone in steady rhythm. Hold position. Pass left. Eyes to wall. The handrail took the weight. The pail was recovered. No water was lost beyond a cup. By dusk, the storm had passed. The open well stood sealed, and every household had drawn by line. Expensive systems had failed the previous autumn when governed by pride. Modest systems now held because governed by discipline. 3 evenings later, with thaw water dripping from eaves and the temperature at 46, the boarding house stayed dim behind drawn curtains, and no new name appeared from that door on any section crew slate. The keeper remained withdrawn from public work and public speech alike. No one entered her for confession, and no one entered her for punishment. The town had enough ledgers open already, and the steps required hands that had actually come. By mid-May, when swallows returned to the assay roof a week later than old patterns, Shane gathered 24 souls on the top landing for the first formal training day under town authority. He set his cedar chest on 2 sawhorses, but kept the originals closed against wind and grit, then passed out stitched packets copied from selected entries under his direct hand. The pages they worked from were neat and severe, seep lines by season, frost depth by month, rope splice diagrams, and ration tallies measured in souls rather than opinion. He did not treat the material as relic. He treated it as tools. This was private grief work, he told the group, palm resting on the worn leather lid rather than the exposed pages. Now it is public method. You will copy every page we released. You will test every claim on this wall. If a note fails, you will mark it failed. If it holds, you will teach it forward. Mercer copied beside miners' sons. Reed copied beside ranch widows. Tomas copied fastest, then checked figures against seep draws with a seriousness that made older men lower their voices around him. By June, 3 full duplicate working sets existed, one at the schoolhouse, one at the church, one in the assay office beside Mateo Ruiz's canteen. Each set was marked as copy, dated, and cross-checked against the rim logs before use. On June 19, 1888, exactly 1 year after Shane bought the $12 parcel, the town set stone markers at the rim and at step 1. No speeches were requested. Ruth Ellery's ledger, Jonah Pike's pail, and Mateo Ruiz's canteen were carried in a plain procession from their temporary places and installed in a glass front cabinet built into the church vestibule, each with a single line of explanation and date. The cabinet faced the notices so every soul entering for worship, voting, or shelter would pass memory before comfort. Reed added one final document below them, the unposted suspension notice, signed afterward with his own hand, and the words, "I delayed when I should have acted." Shane kept the cedar chest and the original notebooks in his own custody through the following years, issuing only copies for field use and training. In the master index leaf, he wrote one condition in block letters: no method is to be withheld from working hands. The originals stayed under his lock. The work traveled. A separate box became a traveling case for tools, then for slates, then for copy packets carried to neighboring settlements that sent riders asking how Quartz Hill had endured the September collapse. Thomas rode with those packets after his 16th birthday, returning each trip with new measurements and different cautionary signs from other canyons. The knowledge chain widened without losing its source. Years later, in 1896, Mercer died in winter of a lung illness and was buried above the South Draw. By his own instruction, no praise of commerce was carved on his stone. The inscription read only, "He learned late. He labored early thereafter." Town records showed that in his final 7 years, he sold water at cost during shortages and funded 2 additional public cisterns above floodmark. No one called this redemption complete. They called it useful. In 1904, when Thomas Bell became water warden by unanimous vote, he kept the old quart board hanging in his office and required every new council member to descend all 168 steps before taking oath. By that time, Quartz Hill counted 411 souls, and nearly half had arrived after the disaster year. Each newcomer received a copied sheet on first registration, warning signs to watch, line rules to follow, and the 3 names carried from September 1887, so loss would remain specific. In 1908, with scheduled terms posted publicly at both church and school, Eliza Graham's original notebooks were placed in a locked schoolhouse cabinet for controlled access days and supervised copying. The transfer was entered as civic record, not inheritance record, and the custody key rotated by written protocol. What had begun as one household's survival archive was now treated as shared infrastructure, with the same discipline required of rope, rail, and cistern lid. The swallows still matter in Quartz Hill. Their early departure is recorded on the church board each summer. Mule deer trail shifts are marked on a map pinned beside the school door. Moon halos are logged at night by rotating watch. If a pronghorn carcass is found high in cottonwoods after dry months, the well is sealed at once without debate. Strange details once dismissed as superstition became triggers for action because action had been bought dearly. The steps still stand in the canyon wall, widened by many hands, iron renewed where rust demanded, rope replaced on schedule, water tested at dawn and dusk. Children still descend first during ration drills. Elders still follow. The rest wait by line. On clear mornings, sunlight reaches the top landing while the lower treads remain in cool shadow, and the seep runs at its patient temperature behind limestone, indifferent to pride, responsive only to work.